So I know not everybody was here for the part on the Baptists, and I'm going to try to integrate a little bit of that from last week just to give you a little contrast there or comparison. But we really are going to focus on the Roman Catholic Church today. And it was actually John Johnson who inspired this whole series, really, because he goes to 8:30, and he grew up Catholic, and he would ask me, like, well, in the Catholic Church they did this. What is about that? And so I would say, no, we don't really do that, or yes, we have this, or something like that. And so I thought, you know what? I think probably a lot of people have questions. Many people who come to the Episcopal Church come from the Roman Catholic Church, probably more so in the North than in the South, but in the South, and only because there's more Catholics in the North than there are in the South. But so I felt like it was important to do that. But I also felt like, the Baptists, they're all around us. My kids went to, what's that youth thing called? Young Life, yeah. Yeah, which is semi-cultish in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. But we're influenced by it, like the "Are you saved?" question and all that, and why don't they accept our baptism? What's that about? And so that was a lot of what the first talk was about.
They think happening is cultish.
Oh, do they? Okay, interesting. Yeah, well, you know what? Everybody has their perspective, exactly. So I want to remind you of something, and this came up yesterday when I was talking about my talk to somebody else. Remember I referenced a guy named Schleiermacher. You might not remember the name, and I was talking about the idea of pieties, which I said was kind of like cultures almost, or like in educational talk, it's like implicit curriculum. Have anybody ever heard of that implicit curriculum idea? So in a school, there's the explicit curriculum. It's actually what's written down, what the teachers teach. But then there's also the whole environment of the school itself. They call that the implicit curriculum. So you go to, for instance, you go to Nature's Way Montessori School, it's going to feel a lot different than if you go to West High School or, something like that. You're just going to walk in and be like, this feels different. The same thing is true in churches. There's a sort of almost a feeling as you go from one church to another. I'm sorry I can't make it more, I can't put other words to it except that, but it's almost like an emotional experience, etc. And I was just sort of like briefly talking to somebody about, I was like, the thing about the Episcopalian kind of piety is it has a little less rigidity than, say, others. And the person said, oh, geez, that's not my experience at all. And so I was like, really? So tell me more. And they were talking about, but what we came to was, in certain Episcopal churches, I think Good Shepherd has a certain uniqueness about this, but in some Episcopal churches, there's a formalism. High church, but even sometimes in what somebody might call less than high church, there's still like this, dude in the front with a baton, and like everybody's very, and then our language can be very off-putting sometimes. We don't call them pastors, we call them rectors, we use sort of Old English terms, or it feels like Old English terms sometimes. And some people can kind of be put off by that. So I thought that was very interesting, but I think they were talking more about formalism. Also, in the Episcopal Church, and I said this in the part 2, or in one of my slides I said this, I didn't actually say it, so I'm going to say it today. The Episcopal Church has tended to attract the wealthy of the society, right? Like, so being Episcopalian was kind of like, I am, and so Charles used to love to talk about how many presidents we had as Episcopalians. And I think there's something to that. Don't get me wrong. I do think there's only been 3 Baptist presidents, and I think there's only been 2 Roman Catholic presidents, perhaps just 1. Is there 2?
Kennedy and Biden. Yeah,
and Biden, thank you. That was the second one. Yeah, but in the Episcopal Church, there's been like 10 or 12 of them. But part of that was because it was sort of a quasi-state religion in the early place because there was so many Anglicans around, So I'm always like, that's probably true, but also we tend to have the upper crust, and also I really do think that there's a lot of Episcopalians that are sort of Anglophiles. You know what that term means, like they love the British, and the royalty and none. And you can tell I'm not really an Anglophile too much, but I do like the English. They're okay. But there definitely is a sort of social hierarchy within England, that this still exists. I think many English people would say that it still does exist. And I don't know if we inherit all of that, maybe in some places. But again, going back to what I was saying, I really what I meant was sort of like doctrinal rigidity. And I will give you one part of history that I don't explicitly touch on here today. Remember, when the Anglican Church was being formed, we went through a lot of horror, right? There was a lot of people burned at the stake. That was very bloody, And so one of Queen Elizabeth I's famous phrases was, "I do not seek windows into my subjects' souls," meaning I'm not going to quiz you on your doctrinal beliefs. But I do want us to worship together. And so we're all going to use the Book of Common Prayer. So her idea was like, come to church. I'm not going to quiz you about whether you think the Eucharist is actually the body and blood of Christ or a memorial or whatever you think, Now, at its worst, that can make us seem wishy-washy as Episcopalians or Anglicans, like we don't really believe in anything, like we're just open to everything. But at its best, which I think we can really live into, we're open to other views, that we see a mystery in God and in our religious beliefs, and that we're open to learning about it. That doesn't mean we don't stand somewhere. I remember Carl Weddell said this thing when he was talking about Luther. Remember, Luther says that famous phrase, "I stand here and I can stand no other place," or something along those lines. And Carl was like, well, today I stand here and in no other place. But tomorrow, I may stand here in no other place. So we have convictions, but we're open to learning. We see our spiritual journey as something that is progressive in the not necessarily in the political sense, but in the idea of the Spirit is constantly moving us to something new. So, with that, let's go. That's us. Isn't that beautiful? Okay, so what we're going to cover, we are going to do a little history. I'm sorry if anybody's like, I hate history. But we'll do a little of that. We'll talk about the Book of Common Prayer, the Eucharist, the saints, and the life of holiness. Governance, we're just going to briefly talk about that. Social teachings, there's a new social teaching out by the current Pope called Dilexi T, and it's really worth looking at. My sermon is inspired by it. I have a copy in my bag. I'm not completely through with it, but it's pretty awesome. And then the sense of sacraments, other than the Eucharist, is what I said. That's what I mean by other. And then the final slide, no matter what we get through on this, we're going to get to the final slide because I think that's important. Are we Protestant or are we Catholic? What's the answer to that question?
A little bit of both.
Jennifer, you looked ahead. All right, so we have to admit that our church was founded at a time when Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. Now, there's a couple of details that I think are kind of important to this. One is that he was 17 when he ascended to the throne. He was 17 when he was married to Catherine of Aragon, who ends up, by the way, giving birth to a daughter who becomes Queen Mary, also known as Bloody Mary, right, who was Catholic. And is one of the ways that when I was telling you about the blood that was shed in the early parts of the church. Now, Mary did her share of killing, but so did Elizabeth. Let's just not be, naive. He sought an annulment because there was no male heir. There was no male heir. So he sought an annulment, and the annulment was. I'm not going to go into the reasons for the annulment, but if you want to, sometime I'll tell you, or you can look it up. Now, the Pope would not grant it. Okay, just so you know. The Pope who decided not to grant the annulment had 3 illegitimate children. Okay, so let's not pretend he was being very high and mighty. I think he was worried about Spain. I think that was the problem. Catherine of Aragon had a family in Spain, and he didn't want to, if he allowed that annulment, it would basically take the royal name from Catherine of Aragon. So he ends up asking around, like, who can help me, do this? And so Cardinal Wolsey, I just mentioned his name because people will hear about him. He goes to Cardinal Wolsey, but later Thomas Cranmer, who is the author of the Book of Common Prayer, and he was the Don at Cambridge at that time, and later becomes Archbishop of Canterbury in 1532. So Cranmer was very influenced by the Reformation. When Luther nails his 95 Theses to the wall, and people begin to ally with Luther, a lot of them, there was a big crackdown in Europe on these people, and some of them fled to England. And sometimes Cranmer, for various reasons, would have to flee to Europe, and they talked a lot, I don't think he ever met, I know he didn't ever meet Luther himself or Calvin himself, but he met his, people that followed after him. So Cranmer was very influenced by Reformation, and he may have been thinking to himself, this is an opportunity to reform the church in England, And so anyway, Cranmer gives Henry VIII this justification. The justification was rejected by Rome, and Henry VIII decides to say, okay, fine. I am the head of the Church of England. And we are. And that's what he says. I am the head, not the Pope. But I am the head of the Church of England. Now, there's a lot more details of this history that are important to this decision. But we don't really have time to go into it. But if people have questions, I can try to answer them as best I can. Now, it's interesting. Henry VIII's own piety remained Catholic. Their piety remained Catholic. They were very attached to the rituals of the Catholic Church. And so did his other daughter, Elizabeth. And of course, Mary remains actually loyal to the Roman Catholic Church. But the piety, like I said, remained Catholic for Henry VIII. Yes?
What was the justification?
Oh, gosh. So,
Never mind.
no, I'm just joking. I'm just kidding. Catherine was his cousin or something like that. It was a family member, and in Leviticus, there's a thing, you shall not marry, or so that was what was used. And so Henry was a little headstrong. We think we have headstrong politicians nowadays, but he had already married the next woman in line, which I think was Anne Boleyn, maybe. He had already married her, and Cranmer was like, I got to figure out how to justify this, and so he starts writing up stuff for the rest of for the other clergy to kind of so anyway, but anyway, there's Henry VIII.
When you say piety, how are you using that word?
So he still liked the structure of the Mass. He still I don't know about all his individual sense, but it was really kind of the structures of the worship. And he, I think, even wrote a treatise on the sacraments or something like that. I'd have to go back and look at that, but that's what I mean by piety.
Kramer did? Or
what's that? Henry VIII.
Henry
VIII actually
he
did.
He maintained his previous religious practices
yes.
after he declared himself.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Thank you, Jennifer. Yes. He maintained his previous religious practices, yes.
Is it fair to say that there really wasn't any other examples of different religious practices?
That's a good question. At the time, though, remember, Luther and Calvin have written, and there are examples of different worship styles and spaces in Europe. But by this time, there's no Puritans, there's no Baptists yet. They come later. There is a movement that's sort of what we will later call Presbyterianism in Scotland. That's sort of being born in Scotland, but it's not there yet. So that's a good point, Michael. It's not like down the street he could have gone to the local Presbyterian church and figured out what was going on at that point. No, a lot of those controversies come later, and a lot of those movements do come later.
There's a chance as king that he had a set of religious practices that weren't exactly the same as what people follow day to day.
That's correct, and in fact, it's not just a speculation. They had their own private chapels and things like that. Absolutely. There's Thomas Cranmer.
He already followed his own religion prior to.
You're right. That's Thomas Cranmer. This is Pope Clement, is on the left. No, sorry, right? I've like forgot my two. Maybe I can read them. No, this is Clement, and this is Pope Paul. So he's the one that originally sort of rejected the annulment. He excommunicated Henry VIII. And Henry VIII was very, very upset about that, and even went to Rome and tried to get himself back in good graces, but could not. Now, I'm gonna give you just a brief sort of history from that time for just a second, because I want to just bring in the Baptists. So remember, I told you that there was sort of a back and forth between Catholic and sort of more Protestant sort of leaning things. The Anglican Church or the Church of England never became, they didn't change their worship to look like, say, a Presbyterian worship service in these early years. Up until the time of Oliver Cromwell, right, which is called the English Civil War. And at that time, there is this movement to try to strip away things, like there's the vestment controversy is there, which is like people didn't want all of us to wear all these sort of this garb and things like that. And during that same time, there's a movement called the Puritans, right? You guys have heard of the Puritans. What are they trying to purify? They're trying to purify the Church of England. They want to strip away all Catholic remnants from the Church of England. They want it to be completely, and there'll be all these things like, that's Catholic, you can't do that. That's Catholic, you can't do that. It was, and it became part of the establishment for a while under Oliver Cromwell. And Richard Hooker, which we'll talk about in a second, he wrote a famous book called The Laws of Ecclesial Polity, and he defends the Book of Common Prayer in it, and it is against the Puritans. The Baptists were trying to purify the Puritans. They did, yeah. So a little later comes the Baptists, and they decide, no, you're still too Catholic. And then that's when they come about some of their beliefs about immersion baptism and the idea of conversion as a direct experience from God. No mediation, right? That's the big thing in Protestantism. There's no mediator between you and God, and that's very important in the Baptist sort of spirituality. And so they set up a church in England. They later get persecuted. They flee, the Baptists, I'm talking about the early Baptists, they flee to the Netherlands and then end up coming over to America after that. And they're sort of they have such a sort of rebellious streak that they can't get along with the Puritans that were already here with the Pilgrims, right? The Pilgrims are the Puritans, the Congregationalists. They come over here because, remember, they went to the Netherlands, whereas the Puritans went to Plymouth Rock. And then they come over a little later. They can't get along, so they leave and go to Rhode Island. They trek through the wilderness and set up a church in Providence, Rhode Island, which is the first Baptist church in America. So I just wanted to give you that little bit of history.
Initially, when you first mentioned the Baptists and the Puritans, were they trying to reform the church?
Yes.
Or were they immediately wanting to break away?
No, they wanted it to just. But their demands were so radical, it was like nobody was going to take it seriously. The Puritans maybe a little less so. There was a kind of give and take, and that's where Cromwell comes in. And there were, and you'll see some influence of that in the history of the Book of Common Prayer if you really want to go into that. But we're not going to. I really don't want to get too bogged down in this. But yeah. So they weren't. But pretty immediately it became clear that they were going to break away. Yeah. Okay. Book of Common Prayer. So I think it's really important to it's important to understand this history because I think it gets lost in the kind of modern era after Vatican II, okay? And I'll tell you about that in just a second. But I think it's good to know, where did we come from? What was Cranmer trying to do? He was trying to put the whole Mass in the language of the people. What was the language it was in before? Latin. Right, exactly. And he was encouraging and demanding the people be part of it. So if you read through the early 1549 version, it'll say, and the priest must turn toward the congregation and say in a loud voice whatever. Why would he have to say that?
Because their back would be.
Yeah, because they would be like this, you know, and then everybody would be doing their own thing back there. We'll talk about that in a second. And the people would be doing their own thing. They would be taking out their prayer beads, and they would be doing this, and they would not be paying any attention to what was going on. Or they'd be gazing at the beautiful stained glass windows, or the decorations on the rood screen, which we'll talk about in a second.
Looking at their phones.
Perhaps when the preacher's trying to really inspire their souls. So both the clergy and the laity were not everybody was like, yes, I really want to worship in my own language. Like they kind of some people liked what they were doing. They're like, come on, I don't want to be bothered. Avoid the appearance of magical thinking and clericalism. That was another major thing for him. He did, and you'd be like, really? Gosh, how is that so? And I'll show you part of that in a second, like how that clericalism part gets thrown in there. And this is a big thing. Discourage the clergy from thinking of the liturgy as their own private activity. So that's the problem. Like if you go into a lot of medieval cathedrals, you have a ton of little side chapels. Have you ever seen that before? And those side chapels, priests would be in there all day doing their thing, facing the wall. And that was partly the whole indulgence thing, right? So you would buy, you'd buy some people out of purgatory, you'd buy a mass basically for them. And then these guys had to do this mass. Remember, they had to do it over and over and over again. And we'll talk about this in a second too, but remember, for them, the sacrament is a vehicle of grace. The Eucharistic sacrifice is happening every single time at that moment. So it's like this grace that kind of, frees the soul from heaven is basically, from purgatory is how they understood what was going on. But it became such a moneymaker that the whole spirituality of it was lost. And then it was supposed to be very scriptural, right? I mean, if you look through the Book of Common Prayer, it's not like every single line is from the Bible, but it is very inspired by the Bible, and many, many things are direct quotes from the Bible. And one guy said, it's scripture rearranged for worship. That's the title page of the 1549 book. So how is it that Cranmer is doing this? One thing is that communion is going to be taken at the altar rail behind the rood screen. Does anybody know what a rood screen is? Anybody? Okay. That's a rood screen. Okay. Do you see where the pews are? The pulpit is out here. You see where the altar is? Back behind this thing. And sometimes there's not even very big windows, right? And in the medieval church, the priest would be back there with all his little helpers, which were also clerics, and the people would be out here. They didn't know what the heck was going on. What's that?
It's from Latin, probably, like the rude people were the lowly.
Oh, yeah, but you know what? That's a good point. I actually didn't look up what the word rude means, but that could be. Yeah, it's a separating screen, right?
It's very similar to the tabernacle or the Jewish temple.
Yes, that's right, in the temple. That's right.
You were only allowed so far in, and then only the priest could be.
Yeah, and I got this picture from Wikipedia, and they actually have another one about where in a cathedral the rood screen is supposed to be placed, which is somewhere between. And if you go into some of these medieval cathedrals, you can see remnants of the rood screen. So in Cranmer, though, he wanted to use it. He didn't want to take down the rood screen. He wanted to use it in his own way. And so what would normally happen, first of all, how many times a year do you think the laity took communion?
Rarely.
Very rarely, twice. Yeah, Easter and Christmas. And then, and so Cranmer was like, and they would obviously not go behind the rood screen because this is where all the priests were doing their thing. So they would come out and get it here. So Cranmer got people to go in behind the rood screen and kneel at the altar rail. That's where our altar rail tradition comes from. To us, you probably feel like, oh, it's separating me a little bit from, it's like, oh, here's the screen. And it is. It does have that flavor a little bit that the clerics are behind the screen, the rail, and we're in front of the rail. But actually, it comes from a time when you were getting into the Holy of Holies, at that point. So, Okay.
Does the Queen sit behind the rood screen?
No, not. But
Sit
remember,
in
the
front of
Queen
it?
has her own private chapel.
Well, so like the weddings, the whatevers, when you see her and she's sitting in the seats.
Yeah, yes, I think that is behind the rood screen. That might be behind the rood screen. Actually, I don't know how marriages use the rood screen, but you might be right. I don't know. There's a picture I have. We could sort of try to figure it out, but I don't know that it is behind the rood screen or not. But good question. I told you about the clergy facing the audience, the responses to demands in English. It's, oh, by the way, it wasn't a daily, every Sunday, partaking thing for them, but it was a lot more by the standards of the day. Even Cranmer was Cranmer was trying to be reasonable and not make too many demands on the people, but I can't remember exactly what the numbers were, but he increased the amount of times that they took communion, but it was not every day. And remember last week, people were telling me, hey, and when I was growing up, we only had communion once a month. Remember that? So, the scriptures are read generously, and there was no need for multiple liturgical books. Just one. So in those days, there was tons of different books. So, all right. So what about medieval Catholicism? Just for a second. So what does that mean? Hoc est enim corpus meum. Hoc est enim corpus meum. Does anybody know? I do. I will tell you in a second. I just didn't know if anybody else knew. Does anybody else know their Latin?
The host of Christ.
Yes, it's close. It's close. What is corpus?
Christ.
Body. What is meum? My body. So what do you think it says? Where do we say in the Mass, this is my body? This is my body. Okay. So, if you say hocus corpus meum really fast, hocus corpus meum, hocus corpus meum, hocus corpus meum, hocus pocus. Exactly, hocus pocus. So, one of the things I do, this is a gesture, first of all, in their belief at that time, those words, at that moment, the host became the body and blood of Christ, and when you said the same thing of the wine, it became the blood of Christ. That was the moment that the bells were rung. That was the moment when everybody set what they had down and looked to see what was going on as the host was raised up and, that this is my body. This was their piety. It became a sort of observational thing. And people would actually go church to church to say, when is the hocus corpus meum thing going to happen here? Oh, there it is. And then they would go to the next one. And it was, I'm joking about it, but they really thought this was a big thing for them. And so one of the gestures, so as the liturgical movements and stuff happened, one of the gestures that is that I use is this. Have you ever seen me do that kind of an exaggerated form? Many people will do this, and then this or things along the way. The reason I do this is because because there was the idea is it's not me creating the Eucharist or creating the body and blood, it's the Holy Spirit. And so this is the gesture of asking the Holy Spirit to come upon those. Now you might say, I don't know if that symbol speaks that to me. It spoke it to me, so that's why I use it that way. So it's not my words creating. And in fact, in some instances, and you'll see this in the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church too, people would say real close, this is my body. Why are they doing that, do you think?
Breath.
Yeah, the breath. The idea that the breath of the priest is transforming that. Now, it symbolizes the Holy Spirit, but that's part of what was happening in the Middle Ages. I told you about indulgences. A sinecure is basically like a priest gets appointed to a place and never shows up, but gets paid. So one sort of theory about the rise of piety to saints. And listen, saints have been part of the church for many, many years, back to the time of the apostles. But one of the thoughts was that the people were becoming so removed from God that they needed to have a mediator, right? Who's the greatest mediator in the Catholic Church? Mary. Yeah, Mary. Mary is the greatest. And where does that come from? What scripture is that based on? No, that's the prayer, Hail Mary, full of grace. But what's the fact that she's the intercessor? What is that based on?
When Jesus was on the cross?
No, that's good, but that's not it.
Jesus?
Huh?
The birth?
Not the birth.
In Revelation, when she's crowned.
That's good, but no.
When the angel comes.
The wedding at Cana.
This is the rock.
The wedding at Cana. What's that?
Peter is the rock that the church is.
That's true, but that's not why Mary becomes the intercessor. It's the wedding at Cana. Because remember, what happens at the wedding at Cana?
She comes to Jesus and says, hey, there's no wine.
Because somebody comes to her and says, hey, the wine is running out. Tell him to do something. And she says, okay. Yeah. And then he says, woman.
And Baptist Jesus said, no, it's only going to be great.
That's right. And remember, Jesus says, woman, what does that have to do with me? And then he does it, though, anyway. So, because it's his mom. And so anyway. And honestly, like, in Catholic piety, like, at its worst, it becomes kind of almost like a mother worship and a kind of pushing femininity into this realm that's like no real woman could actually ever live up to it. But at its best, Mary becomes the advocate for the poor, because she's poor. And people who are desperate go to Mary, like that's why there's all these like Mary, Queen of the Sailors or whatever. There's all these different Marys, good manifestations of Mary as advocate for those who are desperate, those who are poor, and those who are outside. The Revelation one, what image that is used, like which incarnation of Mary, if you will.
Our Lady of Perpetual Grace.
Okay, there's another one though. Guadalupe is what I was thinking. Yeah, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And that's the one from Mexico. And she has a certain kind of Native American look to her there. So now I can't neglect to say that even though Henry VIII had a lot of Roman Catholic piety or spiritual or religious practice, he hated monks. And I will tell you that the monasteries during that time had a lot of property. They bought up a lot of property. They were basically like feudal lords. Like people worked for them. In fact, if you read the rule of St. Benedict, Benedict says the monks themselves should be creating their own wherewithal, whatever. Like they need to do the work to get the food, etc. But during this time period, they actually ended up hiring more people. They would hire people and they would bring them in not as monks, but to do the work so that the monks could go and do these elaborate rituals, these elaborate liturgical rituals. And so I don't want to tell you that monasticism during that time was like pure, beautiful spirituality. There was a lot of real secular stuff in that. And Henry VIII hated monks so he destroyed all the monasteries. He called it the dissolution of the monasteries. And if you go to England now, and I have a picture of one, almost no monasteries exist. They're all like ruins, and he got their property, got their money, used their money to finance his wars and other things. So just in case you thought that we came from a very pure line or something like that. We've already talked about Latin.
Well, a lot of it was, didn't he fear their loyalty to the Catholic
Yes,
Church and the
yes,
money and
yes.
the revenue that would go not to England,
Yes,
but
right.
to the Catholic Church as
Correct.
well.
That's right. He feared their political power as well as their financial stranglehold in a lot of ways over land. Now, he did not distribute the land to the poor.
Oh,
He,
no. He
but-
wanted the monopoly. He didn't
That's
want
right.
them to
Exactly.
have
He just didn't want that to happen. Right. Okay. Now this is a little tough, but it was the best picture I could find during this time. So here is the room screen. Okay, it kind of goes this way, right? So you see the clergy up here doing the mass, and then here's like some choir that's doing the responses if there are any, and then maybe these are some royal women doing their own pious thing. But you notice that most people are back here behind the root screen. Okay, so this is kind of just a little image of that medieval Catholicism. Now, I think that it would be wrong for us to be like, yeah, that's what we're rebelling against, those Roman Catholics and all their formalism and all their nonsense. because there's been obviously the Roman Catholic Church has gone through a huge history since that time as well, and a lot of transformation. And Vatican II was like this amazing revolution in the church in terms of its practice especially, but also its thinking about a lot of different things. Pope John the 23rd's feast day was actually yesterday, October 11th, and he's the one that started Vatican II. He died in the second year, and the Vatican II lasted from 62 to like 65, and Pope Paul, who was the second one, continued the Vatican II. So, the current Mass, I think sometimes can feel more accessible than ours. Sometimes. It's very easy to say. They did change it a little bit since I was Catholic, but it's pretty. I think it's pretty accessible. The idea of participation of the laity is so much more important in the Roman Catholic Church now than it ever was. They were always very clerical. I mean, that's not to say that the Roman Catholics don't have certain rules, but like about women's participation in the liturgy, about lay people's participation in the liturgy. But there really is a spirit in most Catholic churches that the laity is important. Now, part of that is out of necessity, because the clergy is dwindling in the Roman Church in a lot of places. So RCIA was a big thing. That was about the initiation of adults. That happened after Vatican II. And that's our Episcopal 101 uses, I think, some of the spirit behind RCIA. It was a way of adults becoming Roman Catholic. And it's got a lot about one's own spiritual journey in it and things like that. And there's been a big emphasis on preaching in the Roman Catholic Church their problem a little bit was that they were horrible preachers, many of them. They didn't really learn preaching very well. And so there's a big movement now to improve preaching. I listened to a podcast from America magazine, which is a Jesuit magazine, called Preach. And so sometimes my homilies are directly lifted. No, I'm just kidding. But I am inspired by them. That's Vatican II. That's why I said Ethan's our cardinal for the day from Vatican. He's just coming from the Vatican. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the Eucharist. Anyway, we're actually up to this. Any questions or any comments?
Did Cranmer write the entire VCP himself?
Uh-huh. Yeah, the first one, and then, it was later revised by other people, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, it is really amazing. And I think that's a good point, Daniel, and I say this, I think, later, but just in case I don't get to it, we definitely are a church of that book, right? The Book of Common Prayer. That in a lot of ways sums up our theology, not just like the catechism in the back, but just the way, like the prayers and things like that. Like, if you want to know, well, what do Episcopalians believe? Just read different prayers in that Book of Common Prayer. That's what we believe, right? Like, it's in there. Now, does it need to be interpreted sometimes? Absolutely. But, there was something I was reading something about kind of the way the week is structured in the Book of Common Prayer. Yes, Mike.
In the Book of Common Prayer, I've always thought that Elizabeth wrote it. I never thought it was a previous writer.
Yeah, and there was various versions.
Historically, if you read back at those stories about Elizabeth and like that, she was the last one. The major thing she did was the Book of Common Prayer.
Yeah, she did not write it, but
I didn't know she plagiarized.
Yeah. She didn't write it actually. In her era, I think like Lance.
A lot of history I've read.
Yeah, no, it's not Elizabeth. Elizabeth didn't really write any of it. Really, she had others revise Cranmer's original. Like Lancelot Andrews was part of that, and other people.
The 1662 version, right?
What's that?
The 1662 version.
Yeah.
I thought so.
Who?
Elizabeth. That revision.
No, the 1662 isn't. I think. Okay, so forgive me if I get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure the 1662 comes after the English Civil War. Okay. There's other versions up to that point, and I think I might put that on a slide somewhere. But there are other versions up to that point. There's one from King Edward's reign and King James, and then Elizabeth, and then there's the final version, the 1662, which is, by the way, the one that the English Church still it considers its official Book of Common Prayer 1662. What's ours? What year is ours? 79. So wow, right? But now I will tell you that and I was telling John Johnson this earlier. They don't open up the 1662. Most Anglican churches don't just pick up the old 1662 and start reading. There have been revisions. It's just that in England, only Parliament can make a new official Book of Common Prayer, and nobody has bothered to want to go back and make any new version official. So, okay. Anything else for that? Okay, let's talk about this for a second. I don't remember how much I got to the Baptists about this. So the Baptists, remember, they do not call the Eucharist a sacrament. Do you remember what they call it? Ordinance, an ordinance. And by that, they did not mean a regulation. They meant something ordained by Christ, something commanded by Christ. So I was talking to one of my Baptist friends. I was telling him what I'd done. And he was like, oh, that's cool. He said, now part of why we do that is obedience. Obedience. That's a big thing in Baptist circles, especially nowadays, this idea of obedience. Who are you obeying? I mean, the official answer is I'm obeying God, and I'm obeying Christ in God. How do you know that you're obeying then? It's, one's own inner conviction as well as, the community with which you are. But, this, I think I might have said this last week, maybe I didn't, I can't remember. But remember, if you are no, I got to follow my conscience. In the Baptist church, you follow your conscience. And so one person, this is a Baptist, by the way, that said this, the Baptists multiply by dividing. So they're I don't like this. I'm going to start a new church, and so anyway. Now, for them, the Eucharist is very much a memorial. It's a remembrance. It is it's not, nothing happens per se in the Eucharist. It's it's just we're remembering. But by that remembering, we're not just remembering Christ, but all that Christ commanded, right? So they do think of it as developing their spiritual life, but there is no sense of a grace happening at that moment, unless God so ordains. You can have grace during that, but it's not but what about the Roman Catholics? The Roman Catholics really do think of a grace is happening. Now you got to be careful, right? Because you can go too far and say, oh, that's so they just do this magic formula and all of a sudden God has to appear. They believe that God promised to be there whenever this happened. So it's based upon faith. It's not based upon some ritual formula. It's based upon the faith that God promised to be there. Jesus said, "This is my body." Okay, he really did say that. It's not like we can say, well, he didn't really say that. He really said that in the gospel, at least. I'm talking about what the Bible says Jesus said. And but the question is, how? How does that happen? And this is really hard for moderns to understand because we don't use the same categories that Aristotle used and that Thomas Aquinas used. Those categories are called substance and accidents, right? So for the Roman Catholics, the body of Christ is the substance and the bread is the accident, okay? So let me give you another example. Okay, what if right now, what is this called?
Coffee cup.
A coffee cup. I like coffee cup. We'll leave it at coffee cup. So this is a coffee cup, and I actually do have coffee in here, and I'm sipping this. Okay, the fact that it's made of metal, is that essential to what a coffee cup is? No, because people have paper coffee cups, you have ceramic coffee cups, and other, whatever that is, acrylic something. So that's considered an accident of a coffee cup. What is essential to a coffee cup? It better hold the liquid, right? Or you can't drink out of it. So and maybe you might say it should keep it warm for some period of time. In other words, if it was something, was, I don't know, iced or something, it wouldn't really be a very good coffee cup unless you were having iced coffee. So we'll say it's something that keeps a drink warm and you can drink out of it. All right. I get sick of this coffee. It gets stained and I don't like it anymore. So you know what? But I like the way it looks. Just pretend it's pretty. And so I take some flowers and I put them in there and I set them on my desk. Now what is it? A vase. Okay. So, do the accidents change? It's still metal. It would still hold water. In fact, it has to for the flowers. But its substance changes. It's now a vase. Its essentialness changes. Okay? So, listen, that is not the highest philosophy. I just want to try to give you an example. So, this is what they're saying. That some essential nature of the bread changes into the body of Christ. Like it's by faith. Like, okay, if you ate a gazillion, hosts, you would never once taste blood or flesh. They would never say that because that's an accident. Because the accidents don't change. The accident is the bread. The bread. It's always going to be bread. I don't care what legends you read about such and such really saw the blood dripping. That's not the Roman Catholic thought. It's never going to not taste like bread. It's never not going to not taste like wine. If you drank a ton of it, you'd still get drunk. Okay? But in substance, it's the body and blood of Christ. And therefore transmits of itself the grace of the sacrifice of Jesus. Hooker, I told you about him before. He said, look, we agree. We'll agree. Jesus said, this is my body. How it happens, we don't know. Okay? You want to believe in transubstantiation? Go for it. You want to believe that the Christ is just present in some other mystical way? Go for it. But we do believe that Christ is present, in the Eucharist. Not how, but that Christ is present. That was the middle way. That was a quintessential middle way of the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church always has tried to straddle this middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism. So, Jennifer has stole my thunder. The answer to the question, are we Catholic or are we Protestant, is? Yes. There's Hooker. So, let me see. I'm going to go, I think we've kind of gotten through a lot of this. So let me just see what else we got here. So there's the 7 sacraments. We'll just leave it at that, and
I have a
yes.
question that maybe you're planning on covering. One of the things that annoys me is describing attendance at Mass as an obligation. Are you going there?
No, but I can talk about it a little bit. So I assume that what bothers you about that is because of your Protestant rebellion against authority telling you to obey this obligation.
No, not partially maybe. But, it seems to me God gave us free will. Mm-hmm. He wants us to love Him out of love, not out of a sense of,
you must.
I've got to do this.
Yeah, because growing up, it was a sin if I missed Mass.
That's right. That's right. We believe that too.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. That's a really good question, and it probably does what might take us a little farther afield. But Mike, did you want to answer that?
An obligation. I experienced that when I got out of the Navy and went to law school. And you Southerners don't know this, but up north there was a high Episcopal church and a low Episcopal church, and there was major differences in the services. So I'd always go into a low Episcopal church from the time I was a kid. I was all the way at the second. So I moved to another place when I was going to law school, and I went to a high Episcopal church. And this is the first time I ever left the church. The priest was trying to force me to take confession. And I thought, number one, I don't have to do that. But of more importance, I thought, if I go to confession, I won't get out of here for 2 years to go back to law school.
So, okay, you know how in the Baptist church people get anxious about the state of somebody else's soul? They feel like if they don't, push their Bible a little closer to you to kind of get you in the conversation about Jesus, like they're not doing their evangelical duty. In the Roman church, the church has an obligation to save souls. Your soul is not saved unless you continue on the path of grace. Now, I think you can interpret that in a lot of ways. You can interpret that as an empty obligation and command. You can also say, like, well, if the church actually does its job, which is to further a person's spiritual journey, then yeah, in some ways, I can buy into a little of that. Like you know, I feel like we can tend, okay, so please don't take this too far, but I feel like sometimes we can tend to say, well, God is everywhere, so I don't have to be anywhere, you know, and I don't know if that's true, right? Like, I mean, partly the way we kind of got our kids to go to church, was we were like, you know, and this is Marge, I got to give credit to her. She said, we have to go somewhere where someone tells you not to always think about yourself and to think about others. We have to be reminded because we forget, you know, and so like the problem is that a child hears the obligation and thinks, you know, or an adult, you know, hears that obligation and thinks like, this is a mean God who is going to strike me down and send me to hell, when we believe God is a merciful God, right? Like, that's the bad side of the obligation idea. I think the good side of the obligation idea, being charitable, is like, it just reminds us, like, we're not perfect. Like, we can't do it by ourselves. I think, you know, you may not buy that, and I know that people's personal experience in this can be very painful, and I don't mean to minimize that, because some people really were hurt by the Roman Catholic Church, and the Episcopal Church, and the Baptist Church, and others. Yes?
Well, I mean, I think the other side of that, Rick, is there's not maybe a stated obligation with, you know, Baptist or conservative Pentecostal churches, but that culture, that piety within those congregations, in my experience, there is an obligation for you to go to church on Sunday and Wednesday night and Sunday night. Yeah. Like, so-and-so hasn't been to church in 3 weeks.
Right.
They're
falling away.
It's not stated in their doctrine or their liturgy, but it's stated in their culture. Yeah. And the whispers around the people that haven't been, we need to get so-and-so back into church.
Yeah, he's falling away. Yeah. Falling away.
You know, so I think it goes both ways.
Yes.
I think it's the word.
The obligation word? Yeah.
Because, I mean, I think of obligations being like going to that event or that party or that whatever because I feel like I have to. Mm. You know, it's not, obligation seems to strip every ounce of joy. Or
yes, and that is extreme. I think that is the problem with some of that sort of language, is like, you know, I like what you said. It strips, I don't know if I can say it better, it strips it of joy, it strips it of God's compassion, God's mercy, which is why we come to churches, to experience God. So, go ahead.
I was going to go back to the first thing you said, too, is I think in some ways we've gone too far away from whether you want to call it an obligation or the ordinance or whatnot, just in the sense of being community. Like I wish there was a different word in the sense of you come together in community.
So I like to think about it as like, you know, if you want this place to exist, you got to show up. Like, I mean, I'm glad that you can find God in the Sunday morning talk shows or something, but like, you know, like if you want to have a place to come back to, you got to be here to be part of it. Like, and I'm sorry to say that if that sounds like an obligation, I don't know, but I mean, like, it falls apart. I mean, you know, if people don't show up for each other, you know, and I think that's the other thing, is that doesn't mean that you have to show up to a place that is toxic to you or something along those lines. There is discernment involved. It's just that, like, sometimes you don't want to come, but you know what? Maybe just get yourself to come if you want. You know, like just like I love the beginning of the morning prayer is Psalm 95, and it says, "Come, let us sing to the Lord." And I always think of that as come, show up. You know, come and show up. So I think that's I do think too. I mean, I think it was meant well. It was meant to get away from this guilt. Like, I'm just coming out of a sense of guilt. You know, and sometimes, listen, sometimes you have to show up elsewhere, right? It's not always that you have to be here to show up, but you have to show up to your life, right? You have to show up where your life is calling you. And if it's calling, if you want this to be part of your life, then this needs to be a place that you come, you know. So, anyway. Okay.
Father,
yes.
would you say over the past 10, 20, 30 years that the Episcopal Church has changed?
Yeah, I think so. But what do you think? Like
I think
what's
so.
what's behind like
I
what do
think
you
so.
what
well,
do you
then I was going to ask the same about the Catholic Church.
And the Baptist.
Yeah, and the Baptist Church. I
And-
definitely think there's been developments in all of them. Yes, and
Just between the Catholics and the Episcopalians, which ones do you think has had a larger rate of change?
probably. I'll be honest. I probably would say that's a hard one, but I'd probably say the Episcopal Church has changed more because honestly, like I'm reading this very interesting biography of Bishop Pike, who was this kind of nut from the 60s, but he was Episcopalian, and I was amazed at the amount of Catholic piety in him and how the Episcopal Church, I think, was much more traditionalist at some point and has kind of changed over that time. I think the Roman Church has also had a lot of changes since Vatican II, but they've always had within them this fight against the left and right Catholics. You know, there's always been this sort of like traditionalist, and then of course it goes really far to the ones I want the Latin Mass again, you know, and then to the more left-leaning ones, and there's even, you know, radicals there who are ordaining women priests, which we don't consider radical, but they do, you know. So anyway,
Last question.
Yes.
What about the future? What do you think is going to happen in the future in terms of rate of change?
I don't know. Pope Leo wrote a fairly interesting encyclical just recently called Dilexi Te, and it's really worth reading it. It's called I Have Loved You, and it's a quote from Revelation, and it like talks about the obligation of the church for the poor, and which is very much in continuity with Pope Francis. But I think there's already people going socialist, you know, like so it's interesting. I don't know. I really don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I think that what I think. Okay, I'm sorry. We're gonna have to already go all the way to the last slide. I already talked about the saints anyway. That's religious life, by the way. That's Franciscans, and that's a monastery. We can talk about that some other time. There's Pope Leo. That's our 3 presiding bishops. I'm going to talk a little. Social teaching is, I think, a big deal.
You're going to have to do it part 3.
I know. We're going to do part 3, and that way we can. Okay. So, are we Protestant or Catholic? The answer is yes. Okay. So, you know, we do follow the Protestant rebellion against arbitrary authority. We believe that individual belief and conscience is important to us, but we also respect tradition. We want to be critical, but also keep what is good and true in tradition, going all the way back to the apostles. So Hooker was really clear about that. That's Richard Hooker, that he said, we're not interested in throwing everything out. That he didn't like the Puritan idea, like, you know, this sort of false idea that you could somehow get back to some purity. Like, that is something that I think human beings always want. Like, we're going to go back to this time when it was really a lot better than it is now. We're going to go back to the golden age. We're going to go back here, and then it's going to be better. And it like, really, like, history does not work that way. And I think we as Episcopalians understand that, and we want to respect tradition. So to go to Dan's point, I think at our best, we can be a big tent, and people can come to worship with us who believe different things along the social and political spectrum as well as along the liturgical spectrum. You know, at our worst, we can sometimes seem like we don't believe in anything. But we want to live according to Christ's teachings, but we don't accept a single human authority as the definitive interpreter of Scripture or Christ's words in Scripture. We want to use reason in the sciences, the advances in human ingenuity, and technology to help us seek the truth. We are people of common sense. We can be skeptical without being cynical, critical without being arbitrary, open without being relativist. Okay? You can be open to other ideas without thinking there's no such thing as truth. It's just you could be humble about whether or not you have the truth and whether or not you can learn something. So I think you can be open and still believe that there is a truth. Ultimately, we want to be a people of love, justice, and faith. We want to worship God in God's mystery and live and work to bring God's kingdom to earth. That's my sort of feeling about who we are as Episcopalians. And that's the end for today. I don't know if that exactly answered Dan's question, but I tried to point to it. All right.
You're gonna have to do a third, though.
I know. We'll talk about the social teachings and stuff.
You got too much material, don't you?
I know. I always do. It's just sad.
So
I can, yeah, absolutely.
That last one especially.
Yeah, sure.
For
Sure.
people that ask me.
Yeah, like who are? Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah, summary. Yeah, good. Okay. Great. I know. I kind of.
That's my elevator speech.
Yes. I think that came. I almost between you and me, I almost think like this is fine. I read that. But I didn't put it in, but I got that from Charles a little bit. Some of that is you can probably throw Charles in there, and your dad, and so. But I
He
think
always called it a pasture
yes,
with a fence around it.
yes, yeah, right.
Yeah, I would very much.
Sure, absolutely.
So would you be shocked if in the next, say, 5 to 10 years,
I would be shocked about women. I would not be shocked about marriage. What do you think?
well, I think it's going to happen.
You do?
Both.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me at all. And I think there's one of the big differences is Catholics, I think, are tied a lot more to nature of man.
Yes.
Nature of man,
Yes.
and I think that's a huge
I agree.
difference. And they say there's a certain biological thing that happens, and they argue, so they take a stronger position. Whereas the Episcopalians say, well, maybe the nature of man is more open.
Yes.
Right?
I like that, dude.
And so that's, I
that
think,
could
a huge difference. And so it depends. And my last question was going to be maybe cover this if we do a third part is
No, I can't get on my phone and text you.
when should a person convert from Catholicism to Episcopalian and vice versa?
I like
And that gets to
I need to
the
like write that
connection,
down.
the connection between